Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. So I'm going to present, I think, the third presentation of the day. It's a presentation that is really a summary of work, ideas, approaches to reform that has been developed by our program, the Local Government Revenue Initiative Program. Yeah, okay, sounds good. And this presentation will be divided into three parts. The first part is going to give you an overview of the property tax revenue potential. We'll then move to also presenting the challenges that many countries, especially in Africa and also West Africa, face. We'll have a quick interactive session where I'll also want to hear from you when it comes to the challenges that your countries or governments face. And we'll move to the third part, which is presenting the approaches that our program has developed based on specific examples and also the work we have been doing when it comes to research. And we'll have a quick Q&A session. So I think this presentation is really coming at the right time in the sense that we started with trying to understand wealth tax, and that includes property taxes. Then Aziz presented on property taxes, but mainly taxes on immovable properties and transfer taxes. But in this case, we're just going to talk about immovable properties, taxes on buildings, nothing else. So these taxes have different names in different countries. I believe in Lagos, they call it the land use charge, LUC. I believe in other states in Nigeria, that tax is rather collected by local governments and not the state. So perhaps I look forward to learning from you on how this works in your states. This tax, let's say in countries like Senegal, our colleague from Senegal is not here. It's called la contribution foncière sur le bâti. It's property tax on built properties, but they also have other taxes that they call contribution foncière sur les propriétés insuffisamment bâties, so half-built properties. And you also have taxes on vacant lands. That is also a tax that we see in other countries, taxes on vacant lands. Of course, some governments have managed to combine those taxes together to call them one single property tax, but that's not what we're going to talk about. That tax that I'm also going to present is called property rates in some countries, or land tax. That's the case of Kenya, where they don't really pay attention to the built property or the development on the land. They just tax the land, the value of the land, but they call it property taxes. In countries like Malawi, they call it city rates. So I believe with this overview, you now understand the kind of tax that I'm going to talk about. And of course, the presentation is really, as I say, focusing on what we have been doing in many countries in Africa. So it's not only on West Africa, but really Southern Africa, East Africa, a little bit of West Africa. And of course, as I said, I look forward to hearing from also how the systems work in your countries. So now the first question, I guess, that we should ask is, why should we focus on property taxes, or at least for you, government officials, tax administrations, why should we focus on taxing built properties? I think our colleague here was even saying that why should we tax a building when someone has spent their money building that building? Why should we tax them? There are many reasons for that. So property taxes are known for the really high revenue potential. They are also known for being progressive and easy to collect, in the sense that this tax is based, as I say, on an immovable property. The property is just there. Technically, it should be easy to be identified. The second thing is that the tax is progressive. I think Aziz touched on some of these aspects of progressivity, even John in the morning, where tax liabilities are calculated in relation to the value of the property. So in this case, we know that high value properties are likely to pay higher tax liabilities than low value properties. The third thing is that this tax has the potential to increase transparency because the tax is based on observable wealth. Again, if we see two properties, we know that one is, let's say, more expensive than the other. So in a transparent system, a taxpayer should know that they are really paying a fair tax because of the way the assessment was done, and that assessment is based on the value of their property. And usually transparent systems really show how these differ depending on the different values of the properties. So now, as I said, this tax is known for its high potential, and this is something that has been demonstrated in many countries. But here I would like to illustrate a few examples based on the research that we conducted in these 4 countries. And if we look at Malawi, for instance, Malawi has 4 city councils that have the right to collect property taxes. These are Zomba, Blantyre, Mzuzu, and Lilongwe, the capital. And in the research we conducted, we could see that those city councils are raising about 0.16 to 0.42% of tax to GDP ratio. But we could see that with reform, the targeted reforms, the appropriate reforms, these councils could at least double their performance. And that is really at the lowest end. The same applies to Zambia, where in the 3 cities where we conducted research, Livingstone, Mansa, and Samfya, we could see that performance is even lower sometimes than Malawi. It's between 0.05% of GDP to 0.39% of GDP. But again, with the appropriate reform, that can double or even triple. Now, 2 real cases as well. Freetown, where our team was engaged with the city council to implement a property tax reform. During that reform, what happened was that in terms of registration of properties, that also is a question that was raised in the morning. Reformers could really, those who were working on property registration could really increase the number of properties that were in the tax registry by 2. So in this case, the registry had only 50,000 properties, and it was also showing some inequity because you only have a few people paying taxes. But with the reform, then that registry doubled. It went to up to 100,000 properties, and now I think it keeps increasing as they keep updating identification. And of course, this shows that if you increase identification of properties, revenues can potentially increase. In the first year of the reform, revenues increased by 3, moving from 500,000 US dollars to 1.5 million US dollars. And it was also estimated that as the reform goes on, then the potential can even go up to 5 times, can be 5-fold. The case of Senegal, I think our colleague is not here. The Senegalese government, mainly the tax authority in charge of property taxation, the Direction Générale des Impôts et des Domaines, has implemented a series of reforms since 2019 to identify properties. It's a countrywide census program, at least 3 programs. And recently we could see that the number of properties that were in the registry also almost tripled, going from 70,000 properties to 200,000 properties in those times. And again, this is really increasing more and more. And it shows that with that, we can also see an increase in revenues. So really, I think this shows you the potential of property taxes. Now, okay, it's here. So now when we have this potential, I guess the question now is, we have this potential, but we know that systems are underperforming. In many countries, really, performance is very low. So why do we see this divergence? So there are a number of reasons. The first one, or at least maybe I can just give you an overview here, is that property taxes are known for being the major underperforming taxes when you think about other taxes that local governments have to raise, or even other governments that have that responsibility. And performance is estimated to be approximately 10% of that of wealthier nations. And performance ranges in Africa more broadly between 0.1 and 1% of GDP. In wealthier countries, this can go up to 2% of GDP. So secondly, property taxes are frequently regressive, as I explained, and also inequitable due to poor administration. I think John talked about the aspect of administratability. So poor administration also really causes this underperformance. And inequity comes where, or even regressivity, where the well-off end up bearing the greater tax burden. There have been also limited links between property taxes and service delivery. I guess it goes back to the question of why should we raise property taxes? Because this is a tax that is known for being directly linked to services. It's known that if we invest, let's say, in building roads, this increases the value of the area. And it also increases the value of properties in that area. So technically, your property is also being more expensive in this case if you were to sell it. If you have good sanitation systems, this also has an impact on your property and the value of your property. So there is really this direct link between property taxation and service delivery. And governments really haven't managed to provide enough services for taxpayers to see that, okay, we can convincingly pay property taxes, which really is a huge challenge here. And lastly, property taxes haven't created opportunities for accountability. Why? Because most of the revenues that local governments raise, I will learn maybe more about your tax administrations, are often used for salaries, operation expenditures, and less is really spent on services. So this also doesn't give enough opportunities for local officials to be accountable to taxpayers because they don't have anything to say, they don't have anything to show, right? So in this case, really, it's a major, major challenge. Now, when we now see that this is the situation when it comes to property taxes, I guess the other question is, why do we see this poor performance? I'm going to list here a number of key issues. Of course, there can be more than that. But I believe that what I'm listing here is really encompassing everything that we think is really problematic in many of the systems we have in Africa, but also in West African countries. The first challenge, again, it's a thing that was raised this morning, is really highly incomplete property records. So many systems aim at legally registering the property in a legal cadastre, or I think you call it cadastre juridique in French, before taxing it, before making it eligible for taxation. So you really have to get that first step, which is legal registration for titling, before then transferring that information into a fiscal cadastre. But we know that building legal cadastres in many African countries is a challenge. I think we're discussing that, and it's good that we had this discussion with Aziz, simply because it's difficult, first of all, to identify those properties. Sometimes it's done manually by many local governments or tax authorities, and you don't have this comprehensive registration, comprehensive coverage of, let's say, a specific territory or even a country, depending on what jurisdiction is doing that. And in the end, this also ends up affecting fiscal cadastres. So if you don't have a good registration system for all the properties, then the tax authority can't easily also identify the properties that have to be taxed. So you end up having really incomplete property registers. Second, when we think about valuation, I think it's also a topic that somehow came, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss it more, is ineffective valuation systems. We know that, I think I'll take a break for the interpreters. Okay. We know that in addition to identifying properties, we need to value them so that we can know exactly the basis on which we can calculate the tax liability. But many countries use different systems, of course, which also end up underperforming. Some countries use expert-based valuation. In this case, an expert has to go and assess the value of the property, the market value of the property, or the capital value of the property, to then be able to have a value that can, on which a tax rate can be applied, to then know what kind of tax liability or the amount of tax liability that you have to pay. But again, expert valuation can be difficult. In some countries, we don't have really good developed real estate markets, or even data is not accessible. So in this case, it becomes difficult for a government to be able to assess those values. In some countries, expert valuers may need to also go from one property to another to assess the value of the property based on specific criteria. And in some cases, those valuers even are required to access the inside of the property. But again, this can be difficult. Many taxpayers don't allow those valuers to access the inside of the property, so it becomes really difficult to build good valuation systems based on expert valuation, or even rental valuation. In other cases, countries use area-based systems, basically assessing the surface area of the land or the property and applying a rate. But those systems can be regressive because when you do that, you don't take into account other characteristics that can also determine the value of the property. So again, you see more aspects of regressivity. Okay, I think they are, okay, good, you're catching up. The third thing is also in some countries that they use declarative systems. That's the case in Senegal, that's the case in Rwanda, and perhaps you'll tell me if that's the case in some of the countries that you know. It means that although maybe the administration may have a list of all properties or all lands, they will still ask the taxpayer to go and declare the asset, the value of the property, or declare the assets plus the value. So in Senegal, again, as we learned, taxpayers don't do that. Only a few have been able to do that or are compelled to do that for many reasons, but others don't do that. For instance, in Dakar, a research that was conducted in 2019 showed that only 20% of all properties were registered in the tax registry. And in those 20%, only 12% of taxpayers were complying with tax payment. So you really see a lot of regressivity in the sense that only a few people are paying those taxes. So it becomes really very challenging. Another aspect here is also when it comes to lack of automation or implementation of IT systems, which can also be useful when it comes to administering properties. But we see that countries are sometimes using manual ways of administering this tax, manual identification by sending people on the field to do the identification, manual valuation, valuers go from one property to another to value those properties, manual collection, where you also see taxpayers going from one property to another to collect taxes, and then it makes it difficult to have a good data management system, a good revenue tracking system, and even a good enforcement system. So tomorrow we'll go into some details when it comes to enforcement and compliance, but I think that gives you a good idea of why sometimes lack of automation is also a problem. Another issue here is ineffective cooperation or collaboration. I believe if in your government, in your organizations, you know that property taxation is not a tax that is administered by a single unit. We understand that when it comes to identification, that is done by a specific department. When, let's say, the tax is administered at one government level, that's again the case in many Francophone countries in West Africa. We have also the same case in Freetown where rather that tax is only administered by the local governments. So there is no, let's say, shared responsibilities between the two levels of government, central and local. So in this case, let's say within each government level, you also have departments in charge of specific aspects of property taxation. Identification and valuation in some cases can be in one department or separate departments. Billing can be done by a specific department. Revenue collection by a specific department. Enforcement maybe by the revenue department or maybe a specific department as well. So that also requires a lot of collaboration between the different units to administer this tax. Another situation is where you have rather shared responsibilities between the central government and local governments. In this case, I think one example that is coming up, before Ghana centralized property taxes, Ghana, the Ghanaian system was made in such a way that the Land Valuation Division, which is an agency of the Ministry of Lands, was the one in charge of property valuation. And local governments were in charge of collection and enforcement, billing, collection, and enforcement. So to do the valuation, they needed to pay the Land Valuation Division for that activity, but they didn't have in some cases, enough revenues to be able to pay for valuation. And in other countries, maybe when that's the case, the land valuation department can give some discounts or ask the government to pay in tranches. But this also creates some issues. Because in addition to having that responsibility at the central government level, when it comes to approving valuation roles, it also becomes a responsibility of that central government unit. And in some cases, I think that was the case in Kenya, where sometimes the Ministry of Land won't approve valuation that were done simply for political reasons or other reasons. So you can see that collaboration is very key in property taxation. So although it's important, it's not working. We probably will learn more from you, where I think I have heard when I was doing research that information is power. So sometimes you don't want to share information for many reasons. And this really creates issues when it comes to property tax effectiveness. A last issue here is politics. We can't deny that property taxation is political. This is a tax that is levied on properties, including wealthier property owners. And we know that in some cases, wealth is connected to politics. Wealthier property owners may have more political connections than others. Or it can also be that, I think that's the case in Ghana, where you have informal settlements. Politicians also like to go and do some campaign in those areas, and they promise those people not to pay taxes if they vote for them. So you see that there's a lot of connection between politics and property taxation. And also administrative politics. Again, as I said, when it comes to information sharing and everything, when it comes to sometimes having systems that are underperforming because of vested interest, collusion, corruption, when reform comes, then it can be challenging. So political resistance to reform is really a key challenge here. Resistance coming from the administration, because a potential reform can threaten vested interests. Resistance from taxpayers, including wealthy taxpayers, because they want to evade taxation. And also resistance sometimes from the central government in case where the property tax is managed by local governments. Central government may, in many ways, undermine reform, because this means that the local government will be able to raise more revenues. It means more autonomy for that local government, and central government may lose control over that local government for those reasons. Okay, I think maybe before going to the approaches, I think I gave you a good overview of the challenges. The question that I had perhaps for you was whether, first question is, whether the challenges that I just presented resonate with your country experiences or your tax administrations, and whether you have, you want to share with us some unique policy and administrative challenges that you also think are undermining property taxation. I think many of you work on this specific tax, but many of you may not. But I believe that you also interact with tax officials or administrations that also work on that tax. So I'd like to hear from you as well and see if maybe what I'm presenting is similar to what you face, or if maybe there are other things that we really didn't cover that we'd like to learn from you. Donc pour nos amis francophones, donc je voulais savoir si les défis que j'ai présentés en fait sont similaires à ceux rencontrés par vos administrations, ou s'il y a peut-être des défis uniques que je n'ai pas couverts, que vous aimeriez également partager pour qu'on en sache mieux sur vos systèmes également. OK.
Alors, bonsoir docteur, merci pour la pertinence de la présentation. Je m'appelle Kataka Massameso. Et pour répondre à la première question qui a été posée concernant les défis, moi j'en ai répertorié 6 dans votre présentation. Et je pense que pour la plupart de ces défis, nous les connaissons au Togo. Je vais d'abord sur le premier. Vous avez relevé le fait que dans les administrations, en tout cas que vous avez connues, les registres fonciers sont incomplets. C'est une réalité chez nous. Et chez nous d'ailleurs, au-delà du fait que ces registres sont incomplets, ces registres sont, à certains endroits aussi, ne sont pas fiables. Fiables parce que chez nous, la terre n'appartient pas à l'État. Et donc la terre appartient aux propriétaires fonciers. Et quand vous achetez une parcelle, vous la sécurisez. Et le titre de sécurité, c'est le titre foncier. Mais il arrive parfois qu'on retrouve plusieurs titres sur la même propriété. C'est vrai, en tout cas chez nous, et je pense que les collègues qui s'en chargent sont en train d'y travailler pour assainir ce côté. Donc c'est pour dire que non seulement les registres ne sont pas incomplets, ils peuvent se révéler non plus, ils peuvent se révéler pas fiables aussi à des endroits. Le deuxième élément concerne l'évaluation de la propriété que vous avez relevé inefficace, c'est vrai, c'est la base d'imposition. Effectivement, chez nous, ce problème est présent parce que il n'y a pas une base légale d'imposition, on a juste un document de travail. Ce document, normalement, essaye de faire un quadrillage de ce qui est ce qu'on appelle valeur vénale des différentes zones au Togo. Parce qu'il faut savoir que la base d'imposition dans notre législation, c'est la valeur vénale, la valeur de vente du bien. Et ce qui se passe pour élaborer ce document, c'est plutôt des valeurs marchandes qui ont été pondérées. Et donc par zone, on relève des valeurs marchandes et on essaie d'arriver à une certaine moyenne. Et on suppose que cette moyenne correspond à la valeur vénale. Mais vous connaissez la différence qu'il y a entre la valeur marchande et la valeur vénale. La valeur marchande qui est suffisamment discutable puisque il relève des transactions et de la capacité de négociation des protagonistes. Et depuis lors, on a pu observer, c'était en 2018, que ce travail avait été fait pour servir juste, pour donner plutôt un marqueur donc, aux agents chargés effectivement de déterminer ces valeurs-là et de les imposer. Mais depuis 2018 également, ces valeurs n'ont pas évolué. Elles n'ont pas évolué. Je pense que les précédents présentateurs ont relevé le problème d'actualisation des bases. Est-ce que les informations étaient à jour? Donc, il y a également ce problème-là. Et même ce document-là, il est approximatif. Il est approximatif parce que il relève plutôt des valeurs minimales, c'est-à-dire des valeurs à partir desquelles on peut déterminer la base d'imposition des zones. Donc ça veut dire qu'en s'éloignant par exemple d'une route principale, au fur et à mesure que le terrain s'éloigne d'une route principale ou bien de l'urbanisation, on demande de dégrever. Donc ça va perdre de la valeur. Donc il y a ces autres problèmes qu'on peut lier au problème d'inefficacité que vous avez relevé au niveau du système d'évaluation. L'automatisation, je pense, c'est un défi des administrations fiscales actuelles. C'est vrai que nous nous y attelons au Togo, mais du point de vue du foncier, je pense qu'on est vraiment en retard. On n'a pas vraiment encore commencé. Ce qu'on est en train de faire actuellement, c'est de faire comme le Sénégal, essayer d'identifier les propriétaires des parcelles, d'identifier les parcelles et les propriétaires chez nous, les deux. Et je sais qu'ailleurs, ce qui est important, c'est qu'on peut identifier la parcelle et se référer à celui qui l'exploite ou bien qui l'habite. Mais chez nous, c'est les deux en même temps. Donc c'est le défi actuel que nous sommes en train de relever. Donc je pense qu'après ça viendra certainement la résolution du problème de l'informatisation ou bien de l'automatisation. Par contre, en ce qui concerne la divergence d'administration, ou bien, oui, bon, la divergence des services qui administrent l'impôt foncier. On a résolu ce problème depuis 2019. Chez nous, les services de l'enregistrement, de la conservation foncière, du cadastre et des impôts classiques sont regroupés sous une seule administration que vous connaissez, qu'on appelle l'Office togolais des recettes. Et donc, depuis lors, la collaboration s'est nettement améliorée, même si on peut encore l'améliorer davantage. La résistance politique, bon, je pense que c'est commun, hein, c'est dit depuis le matin ici, donc c'est commun à toutes nos administrations. Bon, voilà, peut-être ce que je peux dire au-delà de ce qui est dit, hein, de ces défis-là, ce que je peux dire qui est particulier au cas du Togo. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, je pense, de cette présentation très complète des défis que voilà, l'administration rencontre. Maybe one thing is that we should learn from you about cooperation, how you manage to really improve cooperation or collaboration. And we understand that it's because everything related to identification and taxation are done within the same administration. So this really has improved collaboration. So I guess Togo is a case to learn when it comes to those questions. Any other comments or sharing of experiences? I think our colleague from Ekiti State. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Colin, for this brilliant presentation. Some of these highlighted problems are actually peculiar to virtually all the subnationals within this country. However, I would like to equally add to it. One of the problems associated with this collection of property tax is the issue of non-standardization of address. No standardization of address within the subnationals. Most of all the states, the properties situated there are without functional address. To even locate all this property is a difficult task. So for you to administer assessment bill for all this property is a lot of problem. But like in Ekiti, what we've been able to achieve is this. Remember that I told you that we were able to use satellite imagery to enumerate the entire properties in the state. And in the process, every building with its own unique identification, which is the geocode. So we are now able to develop what is called a navigating app. With that navigating app, once you just input the geocode, it will seamlessly navigate you to that particular house, because we've been able to take the coordinate from using the satellite imagery. So with that, we've been able to solve these problems of having a standardized address to work with while serving the bill by the taxpayers. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that. I think I'll have more questions for you later. Okay. But yeah, that's really good to know. Yeah. Any other comments? Yes.
Okay, so I wanted to share the experience from the land use charge office, or land use charge limited. So they're actually a private company, but they're in charge of issuing property assessments in Lagos. I know that when they started as far back as I think 2001 or maybe the year before then, they had enumerators go all over the state, enumerating each house. So after they finished the enumeration, then they started with their bills. So enumeration, then they started billing. Another thing that land use charge does is that they try to incentivize you to pay your assessments on time. So they tell you if you pay before this due date, you get this discount. They do that. They also give gifts for each house that they see that you are compliant and you pay your bills on time. They give you a large waste bin, personalized by them. Like I said, I know that last couple of years, some of the operations have changed, but I know that when they began, the incentivizing was very key. The discounting on the amount of your assessment was very key. If you paid within a certain period, they will give you a discount on that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's also good to know. I think we'll also go back to that in the, let's say, approaches to reform. I think we would like to know more about that. And I have a few follow-up questions as well for you. Any maybe last comment before I move to the second part of the presentation? We haven't heard some countries. Okay, yes.
Okay, my name is Bolaji. I would like to emphasize on the need for collaboration. We have a lot of MDAs, depending on the kind of information you need. Bureau of Land is there, they can help. Even some banks too, when they file returns, you can get some address from their transactions too. So depending on the information you need, you collaborate with other agencies. That's my contribution.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'll also have a follow-up question on that. Okay, I guess I can move to the second part of the presentation, and then we'll have more time to discuss. So now, when it comes to thinking about what to do to try and improve these systems, reform strategies more generally have really focused on the need to improve capacity. We have heard a lot the word capacity building, strengthening capacity of African countries, African tax authorities. And this also was accompanied with a turn towards technology. We have to adopt IT systems. But we still see that despite huge investments, mainly from donors, to build capacities, to adopt IT systems, we still have really major underperforming systems, which are still highly regressive, which are also filled with corruption, as I said, collusion sometimes between taxpayers and tax authorities, especially in key areas like identification or valuation. And I think for valuation, we can think about a case where sometimes a valuer will go to a property to value it. And if maybe the owner sees that the value is likely to be high and likely to also increase their tax liabilities, they may engage in some corruption, briberies to try and ask the valuer to reduce the value of the property. We also see when it comes to collection, as I said, sometimes a bribery to lower the amount that has to be paid, or what I think many of the tax administrations call revenue leakage. So these are really issues that are still perduring despite the fact that there have been a lot of investment in capacity and also adoption of technology. Now, the question that really we have been trying to think about within our research, but also when we engage with governments, is to what extent can reform be simplified and better aligned to the capacity of the context or the governments where those reforms are being implemented, better aligned to the organizational realities, also the political constraints in those contexts. Because I think to really think about a specific reform, you need to think about those specific aspects. And it goes back to a discussion we had about harmonization. Probably that's not the best approach, simply because we need to think about the specific features of a specific context where reform is taking place. And in thinking about the ways in which this can be done, we have rather thought about what we call good enough governance. To what extent can you design a reform that has this good enough governance aspect, not good governance? And these good governance aspects starts from the notion that you need to think about a more realistic strategy, more pragmatic solutions that emphasize on administrability, equity of the tax system. I think it's a point that was raised by John, but also accountability. And really, good enough governance also advocates for thinking about strategies or reform approaches that fit local context. And when we think about fitting, we think about technical fit. To what extent these reforms are really technically specific to the capacities and institutional context of the countries in which they are being implemented. In this case, we can think about African countries, or more specifically West Africa. To what extent also when you think about the politics, strategies can work within the political constraints as well as the institutional constraints. We're thinking about also collaboration, which can be a challenge. And if in some ways we can't really work within those constraints, how to overcome them. But also a social fit. I think it's really very important when you think about property taxes to think about taxpayers who are paying that tax. to what extent taxpayers will be willing to pay, to what extent they can accept the reform and be able to comply. So it's very important to think about also strategies that can ensure public support for reform. And one of the aspects here is to emphasize on benefits. If we raise taxes on your property, we'll give you something in return. Sanitation, waste collection or something, but visible benefits for taxpayers to understand that government is really working for them, to be convinced to pay tax on a property that they built, right? And in this case, in line with this good governance approach, then reforms of property tax system should be designed in a way that reduce data and capacity requirements. And this starts with the premise that property administration, to enhance property tax administration in Africa, it is crucial to simplify data collection and reduce the capacity requirements, especially when we work within a context where the local government or the tax authority in charge of that tax has very limited capacity. How can we make it simple? Second, strengthening intergovernmental collaboration, of course, for countries where this is still a challenge. To what extent central government collaboration, central local collaboration, or even collaboration within the same level of, within the departments at the same level of governments can be also strengthened, as it is very key for administration, but also for potential reform. Third, to what extent reforms can increase transparency and objectivity, especially when it comes to ensuring trust from taxpayers, but also compliance. Because we sometimes also forget this aspect of trust. Taxpayers need to trust the system, that it's fair enough to then be able to comply with payments. And the last point here is strengthening the link between revenue collection or property tax collection and service delivery. Again, I think sometimes when we talk about this, it may seem that we are prodding from a transactional relationship between the taxpayer and the government, which is not the case, in the sense that the government still needs enough discretion when it comes to knowing what they want to use revenues for. It shouldn't really be a transactional relationship. But knowing how taxation is also based on a social contract, this will be discussed more extensively tomorrow. Governments should at least be able to show a strong link between revenue collection and benefits in different forms, but also visible benefits for taxpayers to be convinced that the system is really working for them. Okay, good. Now, I'm going to go into specific details about the ways in which we have approached it, but I will start with, again, explaining briefly the challenges, then the solutions to that, or at least the approaches to overcoming those challenges. And when we start with property identification, and again, we'll have an extensive session on that tomorrow in the workshop, but I will give you an overview here. As we said, many systems rely on registering the property in a legal cadastre, having this land titling process, to then transfer that information to a fiscal cadastre. And many of you are explaining that this can be contentious. I think our colleague from Togo said that sometimes you have multiple owners because maybe the system is ineffective, or maybe there's also cases of corruption, collusion, and everything. So it can be very difficult to know who is the real owner of a property in such systems. And it also then, as I said, affects the updating of fiscal cadastres. And I think you mentioned a specific aspect, which is local addressing systems. In some countries or even cities, local addressing systems don't exist. So it's really difficult to know where the property is located. And that also can really cause more issues when it comes to billing, even conducting enforcement. And in addition to that, I think lack of registration systems is caused by the fact that you don't use sometimes technology. And I think I'll learn more about how you manage to also identify owners, in addition to identifying properties. Now, key strategies to mitigate those challenges have focused in many contexts, and I think we'll talk about the Freetown case here, of allowing governments to register properties for tax purposes and separating that process from legal registration of properties for other administrative purposes. Basically, if we can just register the property without linking it with legal registration, that should work. And of course, because at some point these processes have to be linked together, if we can use the information that we have gathered when we register the properties, it can also be used in the long run to update the legal cadasters. And this is becoming more and more the case in many countries. We have, again, Freetown and other local governments in Sierra Leone. The legislation allows that. That's the case in Uganda, where also the legislation allows local governments to identify a property, regardless of whether the owner is known or not. And in the long run, they can identify the owner. I guess the question we may ask is, who do we deliver the bill to? The bill will be delivered to the owner of the property without mentioning a name. And it is assumed that whoever is occupying the property, if they are the owner, they will then receive the bill and pay, of course, if they are convinced. If not, they will, if it's a person who is renting, then they will give the bill to the owner of the property. So this is something that is allowed in many countries. And that has been one way of allowing tax authorities to be able to build fiscal cadasters without always relying on land administration to get the information about land registration. And as I said, in addition to that, one way to identify those properties is to use Google satellite imageries and then assign Google Plus codes to those properties. I think this is a tool that the experts know how to use. And here, I would just like to illustrate this with the example of Freetown, where properties were being able to be mapped using satellite imageries, and they were assigned also a Google Plus code. And this was at least the starting point for property addressing in that area. And as I mentioned, by having that first step not so linked to legal registration, the city could double the number of properties in its register. Now, the second question is also valuation. As we explained, I think valuation systems sometimes, as I say, are complex. They vary from one context to another. But the goal here will be to try and assess the value of the property progressively so that high-value properties pay more, less value properties pay less. But as I said, in many countries, they use a market-based valuation. And that can really be slow in some cases when we don't have technology. I think there's some CAMA methods that have been used sometimes to assess those values. But in many countries, they don't have those technological tools. So valuation becomes very slow. That's the case in Malawi, for instance. There will be a reform soon, hopefully. But for now, in city councils, you need to hire a valuer to then cover the whole city to be able to value your properties and update the valuation roles. So this is really a manual exercise that can take a lot of time, that can be very expensive, and of course that is subject to collusion, corruption, and biases. In other countries, as I say, they use area-based systems that are regressive, and this can also cause two properties of the same value to pay the same tax rate, which really also can be unfair. And the third issue here is also when it comes to, as I say, declarative systems. That's the case in Rwanda, where although the government has been able to map all properties and lands, taxpayers are asked to go and declare the value of their assets. They have a system, IT system, that allows them to do that. But the tax authority has no way of verifying that the declared values are the real values. And we heard that sometimes taxpayers declare 1 franc, 1 Rwandan franc for the value of the property. And I think when this happened, what they did was to create some controls in the system to say that, okay, after a certain value, the system will reject that. But I guess you have to get to that stage to really be able to understand that sometimes taxpayers may not be always honest when it comes to those things. Now, when it comes to approaches, then I think here, yes, in addressing these challenges, I think governments have rather relied on what we call hybrid methods for valuing properties, which are rather simple in application. And these methods consist of translating easily observable characteristics into taxable values. Basically, what you do is you don't need to access the inside of the property. You can just stand outside and rather collect the external characteristics of this building. And of course, if you use also technology, GIS and satellite imageries, if maybe that property has a swimming pool, this can also be identified, and use all those points or those characteristics, assigning them points, and then coming with a system that allows you to get to a value of the property and also be able to assess the tax amount. And this is known for at least being more progressive and equitable than trying to rely on expert-based valuation or area-based systems. And again, it's a little bit small, but hopefully you'll be able to see what is here. That is a system that was used in Freetown. And it consisted of, first of all, assessing the surface of the building, basically rooftop measurements. The experts can know it more than me. And collecting a set of externally observable characteristics and assigning them a value, as I explained, to then get to a taxable amount of that property. And it was known that, of course, if we see that, we'll know that a property like this may be assessed at a higher rate than another property that doesn't have the same characteristic, that doesn't have, let's say, the same quality of walls, roof, or anything else here. And okay, and yes, you can see the specific characteristics that were also assessed here. I think it will be more clear in the presentation that Dan will share with you later. And this method was really known for really being I would say transparent for taxpayers, because in addition to doing that valuation system, in the bills or the tax notices that were distributed, the mayor made a decision to add to the tax bill all the details about how the property was assessed, and also what the revenues are going to be used for. Why the council is raising the taxes and what the revenues are going to be used for. And then you can see that the taxpayer receives a bill. It has, it's not visible, a name. If the name is unknown, that's fine. And the characteristics that were taken into account to assess the value of the property, in addition to the picture, which means that when you receive the bill, you can't contest that it's not your property. There is a picture that shows that. And this system somehow worked in the sense that taxpayers, I think, in some cases, we can know that when taxation is also a way of asserting your property rights. So some taxpayers were even eager to go to the council and say, oh, no, there are some mistakes here and there, but yes, that's my property, and this is even my name, you can add me to the system. So it really worked well. Yeah, they're talking. Okay, okay. I'm not going fast. So now, as we shared and I explained earlier, another issue here is the adoption of IT systems. In some cases, those systems may not be adapted. But as I said, we know that digitalization and automation is really key when you have the right systems. But we rather have seen in many countries the adoption of complex IT systems, which can also be very expensive. Governments have sometimes purchased really very expensive IT systems that end up not being cost benefit when it comes to yielding the revenues that at least can make up for the cost of those systems. And that also creates lock-in with providers. In some cases, when it comes to accessing some data, backup data and everything, this is rather the provider who has that information, and it becomes difficult for a government to access that, and they always depend on the provider to be able to do anything. And these systems, of course, when it comes to procurement, can also be prone to corruption and are often purchased, in minimally transparent ways. But we have also seen, and that's the case with Freetown, that sometimes governments can adopt rather simplified systems, open access systems that are user-friendly to then really allow the users to use them more easily. and that are also adapted to the local needs and capabilities of those local governments. And of course, systems that put more emphasis on interoperability. I would like to give an example of Senegal, where we learned that the two administrations in charge of property tax administration, the first one is the Direction Générale des Impôts et des Domaines, and the second one is the Treasury. So the DGID is in charge of identification, valuation, issuing of tax notices, which are transferred to the Treasury. The Treasury is in charge of distributing those bills, collecting payments, and also conducting enforcement. But at that time, we learned that those two administrations were using different IT systems. J'espère que vous suivez ce que je suis en train d'expliquer. Okay. And then information sharing was rather done manually. So at the DGID level, the tax notices will be printed, and sometimes you also have an Excel file shared manually with the Treasury, which would then enter that information in their own system to then be able to follow up with payments and enforcement. Things are changing now. They are connecting the systems. So this was creating a lot of issues. The first one is that sometimes the DGID will issue notices don't have updated addressing systems. So it becomes difficult for the Treasury to distribute the bill to a specific location. The second thing was also that when the Treasury is at a specific location and realize that maybe, yes, it's the right property and we can easily update the information, they didn't have access to the DGID system to then be able to conduct that update. What they will do rather is to share a report to the DGID, hoping that the DGID can update that information. But because of the different responsibilities and being busy, that update was not done. So it's really frustrated local governments who receive that tax, because they could see that there are a lot of shortcomings when it comes to administration at the central government level. And one of them is lack of good interoperable systems. So we see that IT is good, but it also needs to be adapted to those contexts. Otherwise, it's really not a good system. So now, as I said, yeah, interoperability is really a good aspect when it comes to thinking about the kind of systems we need to adopt. Flexibility and sustainability, of course, to ensure that we can update those systems and that at some point they won't run down. And also designing systems that are that can easily integrate existing data and infrastructure. Sometimes we have different systems working in different departments, and there is really no connection, and there is no easy integration of data or anything else. So it also becomes difficult for the administration to manage, to take advantage of those systems. And I guess the last point is also training. We have seen, especially when these systems were adopted in the past years, that training was also a key aspect for at least tax administrations or tax officials who are used to rather use manual systems to get the right skills to be able to use IT systems. I'm sure many of you can relate. And lastly, systems that also aim at avoiding lock-in, basically not being so dependent to the provider. Otherwise, then we always need to rely on them. I think I heard a case of, don't ask me so much, I think it's more of an anecdote than anything else, that one county government purchased a system. And I think when it comes to, they were not managing some of the background data. And at some point, they had issues with the provider, and the provider ended up leaving with all the information of the local government. So really, it can be extremely challenging. Now, the last aspect here is about building trust and public, but also political support for reform. Historically, property taxation has suffered from weak public support. And I can think here about countries where this tax is administered by the central government, where central government may not have the motivation or the incentives to raise that tax, administered by the central government but sent to local governments. So incentives can be very weak. But additionally, I think there was a point here where Aziz was asking which government level should be the most appropriate in terms of administering that tax. Would it be the local government or the central government? And I think you say that local governments probably will be the best because of the proximity with taxpayers. And that's the case. But in cases where you have this administration at the central government level, there is also no clarity for taxpayers that this is a tax that should concern them. And then you have really weak support or weak compliance. In addition to that, we know lots of cases of sometimes using revenues for other uses, and taxpayers are always disillusioned about what a local government can do simply because they think that that local government is not working for them, that the revenues are used for other means. In this case, it also erodes public trust because there is no transparency in the way the revenues are used, and also there is no equity when, in some cases, let's say Dr. Titulola and I have properties, we are neighbors, and I realize that maybe she has a high value property, she's paying the same tax amount as me. So I'll really be not happy with that, and like Skin said, there is not enough equity in the system here. And I think the last point that I mentioned was the fact that local governments may not have, or rather local government may not have enough revenues to provide services, or where those services are provided, they are not clearly communicated. Because I don't think that we can say that local governments are not providing services. They do, although they are not adequate. But communicating also that for taxpayers to see that it's really visible, it's also another thing. And in some cases, this has been the case, and it has really also limited anything related to trust and public and political support for reform. And as a response to those challenges, reform strategies have rather focused on conducting extensive outreach to taxpayers to provide more explanation about the importance of property taxes, but also how the revenues will be used. I think Lagos was able to do that with the LUC reform. I think at some point there are a lot of communications and engagement with taxpayers on why we are doing this and what kind of benefits are going to receive, or at least I think I could see that they are building roads and they were saying that your taxes are doing that, right? And really adopting also communication strategies to provide more transparency and ensure also that there is fairness in the system and equity. And the last point here is something that will be discussed more extensively tomorrow, is how you build the link between revenues and services. This can be done through different ways, but some of these ways have been to have participatory budgeting processes where you put aside a specific percentage of the revenues that have been mobilized, then call this forum to ask taxpayers to vote on the kind of services that they would like to see implemented, and then also have, let's say, a bylaw or a vote at the council to really say that this is what we're going to do. And in some cases, this can also be about earmarking specific revenues for specific services. And again, there will be more explanation on that tomorrow. Now, I think what I explained here is somehow broad, but it was also based on specific examples. But I would like to also tell you that this is something that has worked well in Freetown. And what we see here is also that in addition to Freetown, other local governments in Sierra Leone are also adopting this approach to really be able to improve the property tax system. We have the city of Kenema that is also following on Freetown's footsteps. So as I said, Freetown was able to map properties using that simplified identification system of just identifying properties regardless of whether we know the owner or not, using that points-based valuation method to register, to value the properties, again, without relying so much on experts, having clear and transparent bills that show how the property was valued, what the taxes are going to be used for. And this really resulted in a threefold increase in revenues. And as I said, it was expected that there will be in the future a fivefold increase in revenue, even a sevenfold. And what was key here in Freetown is that the increase in revenues was driven by the assessment of high-value properties. Initially, the system was regressive, so almost all properties were paying the same tax amount. But by reforming this system and having a more progressive system, then high-value properties ended up paying more, and of course, low-value properties somehow ended up paying less. And the increase in revenues was driven by the assessment and inclusion of those high-value properties in the system. And another key element here was political support. The mayor was very clear that she wants to implement that reform and gathered all the support that she needed. Where there was resistance, she was also able to go and overcome that resistance by securing the buy-in of those who can potentially block things in the long run. Okay, I think we can conclude here by saying that what I just presented, again, this goes against harmonization, is not a one-size-fits-all solution to the challenges that your countries are facing, that many African countries are facing, but it's rather a template on how we can think about the best strategies for reform. And in thinking about that, I think Titwa also explained it really well in one of the comments. Reformers, governments, whoever wants to implement that reform, of course, who has the authority, should think about the legal and institutional settings of that context. What does the legislation allow? What does it not allow? And how can we work within those settings and those constraints to then be able to move forward? The capacity, technical and resources, what kind of capacity do we have? Which ones need to be improved? And how can we go about that? Administrative organizations, how does the system work when it comes to maybe the different actors or units involved in the process? And also, if there are shortcomings, how can they also be overcome? And lastly, political dynamics. I think one thing that we have learned is when you implement a reform, you need, yes, a political leader, but you also need reform champions, because that reform affects many departments. So you need some champions in specific departments who can also drive things forward or follow the vision of the political leader. And where you can see that there may be resistance, as I said, that resistance can come from different actors. How do you overcome that? How do you sit with those who are potentially resisting that reform to then be able to get their buy-in? In this case, about taxpayers. What do you do with taxpayers when they are saying that, why would you tax me on my property? There is something that has to be done, and this is really about political leadership. So another thing that I would like to conclude with is that we are a program that does research and also country engagement, and what we have been doing is conducting diagnostic assessments. These are really comprehensive reports where we go to a country, where we try to examine the functioning of the property tax system. Really the whole property tax cycle. I wish I had a chart for that. How does identification works? How does valuation works? How appeal systems work? Do we have appeal systems for taxpayers sometimes to go and ask questions about how their values were assessed? And does the tax authority or any agency that is conducting appeals also allow them to show proof that maybe what was done was wrong and can also correct that? How does exemptions work? We know that systems that have a lot of exemptions can also not probably be productive because you bring more inequity in your system. So thinking also about exemptions is something that is very key here. When it comes to billing, how do you do the billing process? When it comes to payments, when it comes to enforcement, how do you do all that? So this is what the diagnostic assessment process works in our case. But in addition to that, we understand, as I said, that reform is political. We try to understand what kind of political forces can be aligned against reform. Of course, these are not easy questions sometimes to ask, but we find always ways of understanding those political forces that can potentially resist, but also who are likely to support a reform. We try to understand the determinants of tax compliance. Under what conditions are taxpayers going to accept to pay taxes if you were to implement a comprehensive reform that really brings in everyone into the tax net? So these are things that have allowed us to understand how systems work. And when we do that, we get to a point where we try to understand, in all the challenges that we have identified, which ones are so crucial for the tax authority to address, that if they are not addressed, any reform won't go ahead. One example that I can give here is when it comes to valuation in specific countries. I can think about maybe the Gambia or Ghana. No, Ghana now is centralized, so it doesn't work really. Let's say valuation in the Gambia. Valuation is done by valuers from, are people from the Gambia here? Do we have people from the Gambia? No. Okay. Valuation is done by valuers from the Ministry of Lands on behalf of local governments, and they are paid by those local governments. But there have been discussions by local governments of trying to reform those systems by making them more automated using KAMA methods or the points-based method that I just presented. And this means really using technology to do quick valuations, less costly valuations. But you can understand that if you are to implement that system, you put out of the market valuers who have more, let's say, now, sometimes when I think about French and English, I lose the word, who have rather authority over or responsibility over that process. So if you are to reform, the first people who are likely to be impacted are the valuers. So how do you do that? So local governments haven't really been able to convince the Ministry of Lands to change the system. And this is, for us, a key binding constraint. You can think about improving your system if you don't try to also discuss with the Ministry of Lands to know if they are willing to also change the valuation aspect of your system before moving ahead, right? So that's how we have been doing that. And lastly, as I said, when we have those binding constraints, we get to providing recommendations, some key recommendations on how they can go about it. So this is really what has allowed us to understand how taxation works in specific contexts, what are the specific key binding constraints, and what are the specific recommendations that that tax authority or local government can implement to really be able to go ahead with the reform. That's it for now. I hope it was it was not so long, but I hope at least this gives you an idea of how sometimes we can approach reform. And I know I had a few questions for you. I know that some people couldn't also share your insights. So I guess now it's time for you to tell me if you relate with also what I presented here, if you have specific questions on what I presented, or any additional comments on this aspect of property taxation. I know it's afternoon, we'll be done soon. Yeah. Oui, allez-y.
Merci beaucoup. Moi, j'avais une question que je voulais en fait poser à la présentatrice et éventuellement aux autres membres de l'assistance. C'est par rapport à la valeur des immeubles. Nous savons que d'une manière générale, un immeuble, ça se déprécie. Donc la valeur à la construction, à N plus 10 ou plus 20, l'immeuble en soi n'a plus la même valeur. Dans le cadre maintenant de l'imposition de l'immeuble, est-ce que dans tous les pays, on prend seulement la valeur historique comme base d'imposition, ou il y a des pays où on prend en compte la dépréciation de la valeur de l'immeuble? Ça, c'est ma première question. La deuxième, liée toujours à l'évaluation. Pour notre expérience, pour le cas du Sénégal, il me semble très difficile de faire une évaluation sans pour autant considérer de manière intrinsèque chaque immeuble. Parce que même si les immeubles sont dans une même zone, côte à côte, le matériau de construction peut ne pas être le même. Je peux avoir un immeuble R plus 10, tu peux avoir à côté de moi un immeuble R plus 15, mais mon immeuble R plus 10 peut être beaucoup plus cher, pour avoir plus de valeur que l'immeuble R plus 15, parce que simplement les carreaux ne sont pas les mêmes, le fer utilisé n'est pas le même, le matériel de plomberie n'est pas le même. Donc, et tout cela est pris en compte par l'évaluateur. Donc, je me demande, par exemple, chez nous, pour imposer les immeubles, on a ce qu'on appelle la valeur locative. Nous, on utilise plutôt la valeur locative pour l'imposition de l'immeuble que la valeur de la transaction. La valeur de la transaction, on l'utilise nous au moment de la mutation pour les droits d'enregistrement. Mais pour l'imposition de l'immeuble en soi, on utilise la valeur locative. Et tel que nous considérons la valeur locative, c'est le prix annuel du loyer que le propriétaire tire de l'immeuble ou auraient pu tirer de l'immeuble si l'immeuble était en location. Et on a des techniques, des méthodes cadastrales et de comparaison qui nous permettent d'avoir la valeur locative de chaque immeuble pour passer à l'imposition. Merci.
I'll respond in French. I'll try to speak slowly so that the interpreters can also follow. Alors, la première question que vous posiez est de savoir si on tient compte de la dépréciation de l'immeuble. En fait, il y a des systèmes qui utilisent cette méthode comme au Ghana, où, voilà, je ne suis pas experte en évaluation, mais je pense que j'ai bien compris un peu le système, où ils auront toute une liste de questions ou de points à relever d'un immeuble pour ensuite arriver à la valeur. Et ils ont une sorte de critère qui est dépréciation. Je pense qu'il y a une sorte de taux qu'ils appliquent et ils considèrent que, voilà, en appliquant ce taux de dépréciation, on arrive à une valeur finale. Certes, si ça fonctionnait sur tous les immeubles, on arrive toujours à cet aspect de progressivité dans le sens où voilà, tous les immeubles ont une sorte de dépréciation qui serait presque unique. Je pense qu'il y a un taux unique qu'ils appliquent. Et donc, c'est plutôt au niveau des valeurs que voilà, il y aurait cette variation et on considère que les propriétés à haute valeur vont toujours payer plus que les propriétés à faible valeur. Donc ça, c'est un point. J'espère que ça répond à votre question. OK. L'évaluation qui serait faite sans considérer chaque immeuble. Donc oui, au Sénégal, ce que vous faites, c'est essayer de trouver la valeur locative de chaque immeuble, soit en demandant aux contribuables de déclarer voilà, cette valeur locative, ou des fois les services fiscaux vont aller sur le terrain pour essayer d'identifier toutes sortes de critères. Et je pense que ce qu'ils font, c'est plutôt évaluer la valeur cadastrale de l'immeuble. OK. Donc, il y a des systèmes, je pense que c'est des systèmes où on utilise la méthode KAMA, mais je pense que les experts dans la salle vont plutôt m'aider à faire cela. C'est qu'on va plutôt construire un modèle. On va prendre un échantillon de plusieurs propriétés ayant des caractéristiques variées et on va essayer de construire un modèle. Donc, à partir de cet échantillon, dire, OK, des propriétés ayant telle caractéristique ou telle valeur seraient évaluées à tel montant, ainsi de suite. Et on essaie par la suite d'appliquer ce modèle à l'ensemble de la ville. Donc, la question qui vient ici, c'est dans quelle mesure ceci est précis. Donc, je pense que quand on pense à l'évaluation foncière, le défi, c'est essayer de trouver tout ce qui est précision et réalité ou efficience. Et donc, dans ce cas, voilà, il y a des fois où la précision serait peut-être undermined, comment on dit ça en français? Voilà, un peu undermined, minoré, voilà, miné. Juste parce que, voilà, à un moment donné, on ne peut pas avoir, si on veut être efficace dans ce système, on ne peut pas pouvoir identifier toutes les propriétés. Le Togo, je pense, essaie d'utiliser une méthode zonale où on essaie, ou plutôt, aidez-moi là-dessus. Je pense que vous avez une méthode où vous arrivez à grouper des propriétés ayant les mêmes caractéristiques pour ensuite arriver à des valeurs spécifiques pour ce genre de propriété. So Togo is going to give us an example for the second question because I think they have that. And Tito will also be able to respond. Yeah.
D'accord. Ok. Merci, docteur. Merci également à l'intervenant sénégalais. En fait, le cas du Togo que j'ai évoqué concerne essentiellement les immeubles non bâtis. C'est les immeubles. Je pense qu'il y a un micro qui est.
Allez-y.
Ok. Ça concerne les immeubles non bâtis.
Oui, ça se peut, oui.
Ok. Donc, excusez-moi. Donc, je disais que le répertoire des prix que nous avons, oui, le répertoire qui s'applique à des zones du territoire concerne uniquement que les immeubles nus, donc non bâtis. Sinon, chez nous, C'est la même chose. On s'appuie sur la valeur vénale pour déterminer les droits d'enregistrement. Et je voudrais même poser une question là-dessus. Tel que l'intervenant sénégalais l'a expliqué, je voulais savoir quel est le positionnement des droits d'enregistrement par rapport aux impôts fonciers. Est-ce que c'est une partie intégrante des impôts fonciers ou bien ça se retrouve carrément dans les impôts classiques? Parce que chez nous, le droit d'enregistrement est payé au moment de l'immatriculation de la parcelle. Après, quand vous êtes propriétaire de la parcelle, il y a la taxe foncière sur les propriétés non bâties, si tel est que la parcelle elle n'est pas bâtie, qui est perçue. Et quand la parcelle est bâtie, il y a la taxe foncière sur les propriétés bâties qui est perçue. Et quand la parcelle est bâtie, il y a également la taxe d'habitation qui est perçue en raison du fait que vous habitez l'endroit. Et donc je ne voudrais pas revenir sur le débat qu'il y avait eu très tôt lors des 2 premières présentations en ce qui concerne la duplicité de l'impôt. Parce que pour le même bien qui n'a pas vraiment subi des transformations, on se rend compte qu'on perçoit enfin le droit d'enregistrement, la taxe foncière et la taxe d'habitation. En ce qui concerne les propriétés bâties, c'est l'expertise. Nous ne sommes pas encore vraiment avancés là-dessus. C'est vraiment quand on commet un expert qu'il arrive à déterminer ce que vaut l'immeuble sur la parcelle. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup de cette intervention. Je ne sais pas si vous voulez répondre sur la question du droit, des frais pour le droit d'enregistrement. Est-ce que l'administration fiscale prélève ces frais quand un contribuable enregistre soit son terrain ou sa propriété? Mais je pense plutôt les terrains. Le droit d'enregistrement s'applique sur les terrains.
C'est sur la cession des terrains.
Sur les terrains, ok.
Mais en réalité, je voulais revenir sur l'intervention du Sénégalais.
Ok.
Et son inquiétude est fondée dans la mesure où nous utilisons la valeur locative. Comme il a aussi bien défini, c'est la valeur à laquelle le bien peut être loué dans un instant T et dans la même localité. Maintenant, ce qu'il est question ici, nous parlons de la valeur vénale qui est différente, bien sûr, de la valeur locative. Ça veut dire que c'est la zone dans laquelle le bien se situe, c'est dans cette zone qu'on peut véritablement parler de sa valeur locative. Je dis n'importe quoi. Si je prends à Lagos ici, la valeur locative à Lagos peut ne pas être la même chose si nous allons à Abuja. Donc, ici, nous parlons d'évaluation en termes de la valeur du terrain. Par exemple, chez nous au Togo, il faut d'abord commencer par la valeur locative. C'est quand vous n'arrivez pas à déterminer la valeur locative que vous déterminez par rapport au comparable. Pour les mêmes boutiques qui sont dans les mêmes localités et qui ont les mêmes caractéristiques pour voir à quoi la valeur locative ressemble. C'est quand vous n'arrivez pas à déterminer que vous allez vers l'évaluation en tenant compte de la valeur du coût historique inscrit du bâtiment inscrit dans le bilan, ou bien la valeur à laquelle la valeur venant du bâtiment. Tout de suite, on ne peut pas parler de la valeur locative en parlant de l'évaluation. Il faut d'abord suivre les étapes. Il faut voir à quoi ressemble la valeur locative du bien à l'instant T. C'est quand on n'arrive pas. Ça fait 3 méthodes. C'est quand la première méthode ne marche pas qu'il faut aller maintenant vers la seconde méthode. C'est quand ça ne marche pas qu'il faut venir maintenant au niveau de la troisième méthode, qui bien sûr nous triche l'administration parce que le bien étant entré dans le patrimoine à son coût historique, demeure toujours au coût historique dans le patrimoine. Or, l'administration n'ayant pas d'autres informations sur le bâtiment, elle est obligée d'utiliser la valeur historique pour déterminer la valeur locative. Donc, sa question, elle est bel et bien fondée. Est-ce que nous parlons en termes de valeur locative ou bien nous parlons en termes de l'évaluation de l'immeuble. Parce que quand on parle de l'évaluation de l'immeuble, l'immeuble construit, comme il a dit, avec d'autres matériels, peut avoir une valeur vénale plus chère qu'un immeuble construit avec d'autres matériaux, bien qu'ayant situé sur les mêmes territoires. Donc il faudrait que, quand même, à un moment donné, que vous puissiez nous expliquer, est-ce que si vous nous demandez de revenir carrément pour l'évaluation en tenant compte de la valeur du bâtiment, ou bien on peut garder toujours les méthodes que nous utilisons. Merci.
Okay. Je vous remercie pour cela. For those who are following with interpretation, were you able to get the comments? The question is, if we're assessing the value of a property, are we using the rental value of the property? Or are we using other criteria? In this case, it's rather what we call a comparative method, where we'll say that, okay, we are unable to get the rental value of the property. Can we see if there are other properties that have the similar characteristics that we can, and for which we have that rental value that we can use to apply that rental value to the property where we can't identify the rental value? Or are we going to rather get the historical value, if I can interpret it this way, of the property? In this case is the market value of the property. So that's the question that he's asking. I'll be able to respond, but I think I have two comments here. Let's start with Itilola and then Aziz.
Thanks very much. Right. So I just wanted to say that my understanding, bearing in mind I'm listening to the interpretation, is that there are information asymmetries that make it impossible for administrators sometimes to know what the actual market value of a property is. Usually, property tax is based on market value of the building. But where you don't have that, then you start to look for approximations. So first of all, let's recognize the information problem. Because of that, then various administrations use other methods to approximate the value. It could be rental value, it could be evaluation done by an expert, and it could also be the simplified valuation methodology that Colette talked about. I'm going to talk about the simplified valuation methodology because it's what Logri has used in a number of locations and it's working. Now, before I go into it, I would say one of the strongest, benefits of using that simplified methodology is that it ensures horizontal equity so that properties that are of similar type are valued similarly and therefore pay similar taxes. And it also ensures vertical equity where properties that are of a higher grade pay more than those properties that are perhaps cheaper built. And that, for me, is one of the key things that it's critical, really, to property taxation. Now, in the simplified valuation, Colette explained that what actually happens is that once those, you remember the picture she showed you with the GIS map, the rooftop with the polygons on it. So what happens is that a model is developed. Now, I am not a valuation expert, but I have a background as an economist. And in economics, we do something called regression. So the regression, what they actually do is to go out and collect, once you draw those rooftop polygons and assign GIS identifiers to each of the properties, you send people out into the field to do what we call ground truthing. So they then ensure that what is in your map is what is on ground, and they collect the characteristics of each building. Now, you don't need very highly trained experts to do this. Data collectors can just go out and do it. And when they go out, they collect the characteristics that we have in our, in developing the model, determined are highly correlated with the value of the property. So, for example, what type of roof material does the building have? If I have a house and I've used corrugated, aluminium sheets on my house, I certainly cannot, it won't be of the same value of this house in this picture. So that when they collect the characteristics of my house, with the corrugated aluminium sheets and the characteristics, for example, of Colette's house, with that, she will have to pay more than I would because my house is not as valuable. And I think that is where your question on depreciation comes in. All of that will be estimated in the model. And that model, again, like I said, approximates the market value of the property. And what we found is actually that once we've done the model, and in calibrating that model, we engage expert valuers as well. Once we've done that model, and you then bring all the characteristics and you put it into the model, it's able to estimate and approximate the market value of the property. And we found that with a good degree of precision too. So what we do also is to compare what the experts say with what our model is saying, and we find that it's not that far from one another. But more importantly, even if it's not exact, it is ticking the box of equity, both horizontally and vertically, which is what is more important. So, I think every context will be different, but we can get into the specifics of your context, if you wish, outside of this. But the important thing to note is that the methodology must approximate the market value of the properties, but it should also bear in mind that equity criteria in doing so, and bear in mind what information is available for you to do it. So I hope that helps to clarify some of this. Thank you. Sir.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Itola. I think Aziz also had a comment on your question, et il va prendre la parole pour clarifier cela. But thank you very much. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I would like to add a small comment on that. I think I will speak in French for my friend from Togo. Ok, donc je pense que nous parlons tous de la même chose, de la détermination de la base imposable. Ok, donc dans certaines juridictions, je pense qu'au Togo, vous avez choisi la méthode de la valeur locative en premier. Et quand la valeur locative n'est pas déterminable, vous essayez de l'estimer en ce que le propriétaire aurait reçu comme location pendant une année. Et là, quand on n'arrive pas à déterminer cela, on passe maintenant à l'évaluation de la valeur vénale ou du prix historique. Ok, ça c'est une approche du Togo qui est très bien parce que vous voyez que l'implémentation, la mise en œuvre de cela est plus facile pour l'administration fiscale togolaise parce que vous avez accès à ces informations plus facilement. Mais dans certains pays, ils ont choisi d'aller directement à l'évaluation de la valeur réelle du bien parce qu'ils ont la capacité peut-être de le faire. Et ils vont directement à cette... Donc, les pays ont différentes approches par rapport à l'évaluation de la base taxable. Soit on passe par la valeur locative, la valeur réelle du bien, c'est-à-dire la valeur vénale, ou encore, souvent c'est juste la surface. On a pris l'exemple du Burundi qui, vu qu'ils voient que ça va être difficile pour eux d'implémenter tout cela, ils ont décidé de partir sur la surface et les matériaux de construction qui ont été utilisés. Donc ça aussi, c'est une autre approche. En fonction de la faisabilité, en fonction des moyens dont vous disposez, vous pouvez choisir la méthode qui vous convient le mieux pour déterminer la base taxable. Voilà. Maintenant, par rapport à la question de la multiplicité de la taxation, vous avez parlé de droit d'enregistrement, de impôts fonciers et taxes d'habitation. Le droit d'enregistrement est une taxe de mutation. C'est une taxe de mutation qui intervient au moment de la mutation, de changement de propriété du bien. Et la taxe foncière, c'est une taxe de propriété, parce que je suis propriétaire d'un bien, c'est différent. Là, la première, droit d'enregistrement, c'est une taxe sur une transaction. Et la deuxième est une taxe sur le capital. Maintenant, la taxe d'habitation, c'est plus une taxe locale qui est collectée par comment on appelle ça, les autorités locales. Parce qu'on habite dans la région, dans la municipalité, on paye cette taxe d'habitation parce qu'on habite, c'est plus pour dans les pays où ça existe, c'est plus pour les autorités locales. Okay? Donc, c'est différents types de taxes, mais ça vise différents aspects. Soit le transfert, soit la propriété du capital, ou le fait qu'on habite dans une localité, mais ça, c'est plus une taxe locale. Voilà. Donc, généralement, les mutations immobilières sont exemptées de TVA parce qu'ils ont déjà payé les droits d'enregistrement sur le transfert dans plusieurs juridictions. J'espère que j'ai répondu à votre question et merci.
Merci beaucoup, Aziz. We'll take a last comment, but I would just like to also add some comments here. I think what Aziz is saying and what Itol was explaining is the points-based method is one method that can be used in specific context, and it has been used in Freetown. So I guess the point we need to keep in mind is legislation in some ways needs to allow that, or at least legislation needs to be flexible enough to allow any innovative method. We can't just, let's say, implement any method in a specific country if legislation is not allowing it. And what Aziz explained was that different countries have different ways of valuing properties, some using rental values, some using capital values. And I think when you talked about the depreciation aspect, that's also a specific method in a country like Ghana where they use the capital value but also apply the depreciation of the asset. Some countries just use the area-based method. And then, as I say, Freetown was at least able to adopt this points-based method, and other countries are also following up. Muzuzu did this, I think. Kampala, in some ways, also have almost a similar method. So the bottom line here is we also need to look at the legislation first. What is the legislation allowing? And if the legislation is flexible enough, can we maybe integrate other innovative methods that can work in that specific context? And in our case, what we have learned is that methods like the points-based method also can work in the sense that they are so easy to implement than, let's say, a method that allows, you're asking a question about getting more information about the pipes, the plumbing conditions of the property. These are not things that can be easily identified by, let's say, a valuer. So in this case, really, we need to see what works in specific contexts. I'll stop here and take your comments, sir, and then, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Incidentally, I've done some real estate. I've done some real estate thing before, and one of the things that has been observed is that even in Nigeria, if you call 5 estate valuers to value a property, most likely you are going to get 5 different values. So it's not valuation is not so scientific for us to say one size fits all. And that's why you will need to look at your own locality, your own environment, and look at what to apply. For example, if you now want to apply something that you do not have the technology to back up, you're going to end up frustrated at the end of the day. So part of the dynamics we use is, okay, the community, when we wanted to start, we call communities, stakeholders from every local government in the states. What are your views? What do you want? How do you want it? And then they said they want us to be able to determine how much is collected in their locality. And so in that case, if you want us to determine to give you what is collected in your locality, and then the selling thing now is that the more you pay, we are able to keep record of it, the more government presence you may likely find in your locality. So getting their buy-in now enables us to say, okay, for the cities, this is what we're going to charge you. For this kind of community, looking at the social amenities and whatever we have there, this is what we are going to charge you. So we have their buy-in. They are interested in collecting as much as possible in their locality. And so we can then look at which method. Of course, the more we are at it, the more we will develop such models like Titi mentioned that could even be more scientific. But at this junction, the best is just to take all those several methods, look at the one that you can apply in your environment to get the best. But to think that we can get one and then that will fit everybody it's going to be a tough one. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this comment, and I like that you linked it also to sometimes adapting that to the needs of the community so that you can then provide those benefits and then get more buy-in from those communities. Titola also wanted to add a last comment. It will be the last comment,
yeah.
and then we'll conclude because I think we have the last presenter who is also waiting, and we'll have to be here. Yeah.
So just to make it pretty quick, is to just add to the fact that, so you will recall that when I made my intervention, I talked about the information problems that we have, where your law asks you to do something that you don't have the information for, there's a problem. And that is why I was saying that, you know, I gave the example of Kama. As Aziz said, there's so many methodologies out there, much of them enshrouded in the different laws. So you as Colette said, you must look at what your law allows you to do. And if you find that the information requirement for doing it is not easily met in your context, you should consider changing the laws. So I'll give you an example. In Zambia, where we've worked, they're actually in the process of changing the laws to allow for something that makes more sense. However, changing laws take time. So in the interim, you find ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we'll conclude here. I would like to thank you very much for your contributions to this session. I think we learned a lot, and your questions also allowed us to think more about, you know, how we want to do things better. So I'd like to give us all a round of applause for this, and then move to the next session. Thank you.